It's so critical to take care of your people and make sure as you're going through, any situation that you're growing and developing the right talent, but you're also just keeping tabs on your team, making sure they're empowered, continually revisiting your org to make sure it's the right org. We typically really revisit that almost once a year where we're saying, okay, do we need to move people around to get people in the right seats and give people a new challenge and, help solve the problems we have ahead of us this year. And I just don't think you can underestimate that enough.
Welcome to Supply Chain Champions, the show brought to you by Project 44, where we're talking to the people who make supply chains work.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Supply Chain Champions. I am your host, Eric Fullerton, and I have the great pleasure to be joined today by Kristen Kravitz. Kristen is the Group Vice President of Transportation at Abercrombie Fitch. Kristen, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
The way I wanted to start our chat today is, when you think about Abercrombie Fitch and the brand that it was maybe in just a decade or so ago, but certainly through the 90s and early 2000s, what that brand is today is completely different. It's really been revolutionized. And when you're rebranding and, seeing the success that Abercrombie has had from that, in order to actually deliver on that, you really need to have that supported by supply chain and transportation. And you've had really an inside seat to this experience. And I wanted to get your take and maybe a little bit of the journey and the story that you've been through there.
It's an exciting story, and it's been a really interesting journey. I've been at Abercrombie almost 9 years now. And so I really started right around the time that we were probably at a pretty low point, actually. And I came from another turnaround in the transportation logistics industry that wasn't so successful. There were some touch and go moments when I first started where there was a lot of, talk of potentially being sold to a competitor or the like. And so it's been a really fun and exciting journey to be, part of coming in and then seeing that transformation. And it's really been a very thoughtful and holistic rebuilding of all of the brands as we've gone through the last 9 or so years. And it's been really exciting. We have fantastic leadership that's been really, really thoughtful and cohesive about thinking about our brand purpose, our focus on the customer, building completely new organization structures that help to support that model and do things better than really anyone else in the specialty retail space, in my opinion. We have an incredibly strong focus on the customer, and that's really been the driver of the turnaround and the transformation. And so, yes, absolutely, supply chain is a huge part of that. From a last mile perspective, for us, delivering and being able to deliver to the customer and what their expectation is really critical. Being able to fulfill, the e-com orders and the e-com space the way that we need to, and work really, really closely with our digital teams on that customer experience. Designing the right customer experience is really critical. And then, backing up further, being able to support our brand teams to get the inventory here and to support the inventory strategies. And none of that happens without a strong supply chain. So both excited about the transformation and the brands and the company over the past, decade, but also the transformation that we've seen has been really an amazing experience as well.
There's a lot of conversation about supply chain transformation and supply chain digitization, but doing it is more complex and it's more nuanced. Talk through that a little bit.
Transformation often, a lot of times people think of it as new systems, new roadmaps on PowerPoint slides. I think a tremendous amount of the work of it is in the organization, the teams, the structure of the teams, the processes that the teams have across the entire organization, not just within supply chain, and really getting all of the teams that are critical to the process moving in sync. And it's about execution. And I think that's been a very special thing about, Abercrombie is not just redesigning the way things should go, but the execution is top notch. And we're able to really work in sync across all of the cross-functional teams. It's been a big enabler to our success. And it is really critical within the supply chain as well, right? So we can't just be doing things in silos. We need to be working across each of those teams and building processes that allow us to not just be reactive, but be proactive as well, to be calling out what's going on to our cross-functional stakeholders, for them to be telling us what their priorities are, and for us to be able to work in sync to be able to deliver those priorities. The transformation needs to be really people driven and process driven, not just the story around what we're trying to do or the systems that we're working within.
We talk a lot about tech in the transformation space, and it's really important. But when we talk to, supply chain leaders very, very consistently, it's like there's a huge people component, of course, but then the process, which is something that maybe it's less sexy, maybe less the headline of the talk, but it is instrumental to actually making it possible. One thing I wanted to kind of chat about is the last mile experience, that direct to consumer experience. And you touched on it earlier, but that is such a critical way to interact with the consumer and with the customer. It's part of delivering on the brand promise for Abercrombie. So can you talk a little bit about how you took that existing, direct to consumer last mile experience and started to evolve that?
With last mile, really, it starts in the checkout process, right? To your point about brand promise, the experience of, how our customers interact with us on the website, what they see when they're checking out, the expectations that are set at that point in terms of what we're going to deliver, how we're going to deliver it, when we're going to deliver it. That's really critical for us to be in lockstep with our digital team so that we all can stand behind, the brand promise that we're trying to deliver. Mm-hmm. And then from a transportation perspective, there's a ton that goes into that, right? So it starts with, obviously the network that you set up and how you integrate that into all of your systems, everything that you're doing. Prior to COVID, when our e-com business was, smaller as a proportion of our total business, we were 100% a FedEx shop, right? So we did everything through FedEx. And then very quickly through the e-com explosion that was COVID, learned that we can't just be a FedEx shop, mm-hmm. right? We need to continue to diversify our base. We need to make sure we have the right partners that can deliver. We need to develop strategic partnerships with those service providers so that we trust what they're, able to provide for us. And then the integrations of how we pull all that together are really complex. When you're using one provider, as we did in the past, it's fairly straightforward, right? You have a very simple sort of set of calculations that you use to figure out how you're going to use that partner to deliver to the customer. When you have 3 or 4 different companies that you're using, as we did as we went through the COVID experience, it made those integrations, it made those decision points a lot more complex. It really shone a light on the fact that we needed really clean supply chain visibility, which is when we brought on Project 44 to help support that piece of things, because we had never really had outbound transportation last mile visibility before to be able to look at all of these carriers, in comparison to each other. And so we really started to evolve by, bringing on different partners with different opportunities and experience for the last mile customer, bringing in new visibility technology, like I said, and then really starting to be able to differentiate that experience. So, we're continuing along that journey. We've since added same-day delivery in the last couple of years. We continue to add new experiences there, and then really start to think about, how do we personalize the experience for the customer, and how does that flow through, every aspect of their delivery experience. I think it's an exciting area that will continue to evolve there.
I wanted to talk a little bit about you and your role, right? So, you're the group vice president of transportation. Let's imagine that, we have folks who maybe don't have so much supply chain or tech or transportation experience. Like, what are you responsible for doing? Like, what does that actually mean? If you could share some of that with us, that'd be great.
I mean, it's a role that changes all the time, to be honest. And one thing I love about my time at A&F is I've been at there for probably close to 9 years, and I've had probably 6 different jobs in that time with various titles. And I have probably done just about every job in the supply chain except run a distribution center at this point, which is what I always tell people. So it's exciting. And we continue to, change and evolve people's roles. It's never really one thing. Right now, I have a pretty fun portfolio because I'm responsible for a couple of different things. Operationally, I'm responsible for all of our shipments from factory into our distribution centers around the world, and then all the global trade compliance. So, that's a whole set of challenges, obviously, that intersects heavily with geopolitics and international affairs and trade policy and everything else that's going on in the world right now. But we interact significantly with our cross-functional partners like sourcing and planning and merchandising to make sure that we're delivering on, the promise to get product here when it needs to be, that we're agile in how we do that, and that we, get product here in a timely way. I also have our outbound transportation team in North America. So that's really all of our operations from distribution center to stores, distribution center to our e-com customers, which is obviously a really exciting and dynamic space as at all times that we continue to evolve in as well. And really, to your earlier question, touches on that end customer experience. The other part of my portfolio that I really love is I'm responsible for all of our transportation expense management, freight audit and pay, visibility and our visibility systems, our technology applications that support transportation and our omnichannel capabilities, and our supply chain data, engineering, reporting and analytics teams. So it's a lot of fun because I not only have the operational portfolio, but I'm also always thinking about our future state supply chain strategy. How do we bring new systems in? How do we connect data better to make better decisions? And how are we going to evolve in that area? And so having both, the operational day to day and sort of grounding in, what are we trying to accomplish? What are we trying to deliver for the business? And then how can we continue to improve and make that better, with data and systems is a really nice blend of things because I, can't really get too much in the ivory tower. That, piece of it keeps my brain, working on a different level than just kind of constantly being in the operational sphere. So it's a nice blend, but I get to really focus on both. So in any given day, I'm working, with the teams on, how to improve the operational KPIs, helping them understand, and interact with the business teams and what they're trying to achieve and, driving that vision, but then also, really driving future state strategy as well.
Thanks for sharing that. The data ecosystem and connectivity component. I think that's something that if you're in the industry, we've really been talking about the data and, the quality and accuracy of data for decades. And I think it's getting better, but with all those new systems adds all of these new data layers and this new complexity. It's better, but it's also harder in its own way. Like, can you talk a little bit about how you think through that?
I agree with you. I think we've been talking about data forever. Supply chain data in particular, I find the challenge really comes with the fact that supply chain data is so siloed typically, right? If you think about the breadth of systems that we use operationally across supply chain, from warehouse management systems, transportation management systems, freight audit and pay systems, layered in visibility, there's a tremendous amount of complexity there. We also interact with a massive amount of third-party carriers, right, that feed data into our systems, which isn't really the case in a lot of other parts of our business and specialty retail. So, we recently went through a pretty significant inbound visibility transformation where we brought P44 in for our inbound visibility. We upgraded our TMS platform that we have with E2Open. And it was a complex project as we were upgrading and layering in all these systems. But the real complexity came with, the massive number of logistics service providers that we have to integrate into that ecosystem, right? And all the integrations and network that you have to do. So there's a lot that's happening. And I know we've been going through an integration modernization journey, data modernization journey to help make that a cleaner, smoother experience. And it's definitely improving. A lot of the talk now that I think is really exciting for the future is how do we create more connection points between supply chain data, both in its own ecosystem, right? So making some of those connections with logistics service providers, technology service providers, shippers, all of those connection points cleaner and easier to use, which I think will come, over time with technology. But then also, how do we connect data better within our own companies, right? So we're having a lot of conversations right now around use cases on how do we connect planning data, so our sales plan data with supply chain, with finance, with sourcing, all of these systems we have within the company, and pull them into usable applications and user interfaces so that we can make better, faster decisions. So it's happening, and I can see the use cases starting to emerge, and we're starting to have a lot of really interesting conversations about how we can pull all that together in a much more automated way. As with everything, it's taking time to get there.
Yeah, of course. I wanted to transition a little bit and talk about your journey, right? I think you and I have actually chatted about this probably in a more casual way, but you mentioned how your tenure at A&F, but how do people get into supply chain? I think is really interesting. So
Yeah.
I would love for you to take me through a little bit of your kind of career journey and progression and how you got to where you are.
Yeah, I feel like people who are in supply chain, most of them didn't think they were going to go into supply chain. Very few people start out gung ho, I'm going to go into supply chain. When I was an undergrad, I studied international business, and I was at Northeastern University, which has a decent supply chain program. And, I had a number of friends in it. And I remember thinking at the time, I don't want to do that. That's boring. Supply chain is boring. I don't want to do that. I don't know why I thought that at the time, but I was, maybe thought some other things were a little sexier and studied more in the finance and marketing space, but then, really kind of got caught up in the idea of business and politics and international affairs, and ended up kind of starting my career in Washington, D.C. with a heavy focus on business and policy, which is sort of ironic given my role now because it's actually highly relevant, right? But, was in that space. And then after, 4 years or so, decided to go back to grad school, initially with a focus on environmental sustainability. So I went back to get my master's in public policy at UCLA, thought California would be a great place to, study environmental policy, moved across the country. And then as I'm, furiously writing my public policy applications and thinking about what do I want to do with this degree? How am I going to use it? Trying to sell myself to, a master's in public policy program. One of the realizations I had was, I'd really actually want to stay in the private sector. I'd love to, consult with businesses on how they can become more environmentally friendly, how to use environmental regulation as an advantage versus, just a threat. As I was doing this, I was like, well, I need to get my MBA too. Like this, this is probably a dual degree opportunity. So long story short, ended up getting my MBA and my master's in public policy at UCLA. But as I was going through the process of looking for an MBA internship, it was 2009, which for those who remember was kind of the last, bottom out of the last recession, right, that we had. And so it was not easy to find a job, right? I'd kind of dried up and I was trying to figure out, what I was going to do. And actually ended up getting recruited for a company called UTI Worldwide, which was a third-party logistics company. And the gentleman who recruited me, who was my boss for quite a while, did a lot of kind of side hustle work in the company on environmental sustainability. So I was like, okay, great. This gives me a little bit of an in to, see what operations is about. It was kind of a supply chain strategy role, network design, that kind of thing. It had some nice, intersection points with what I was interested in. And I went into their supply chain design and innovation team for the summer as an intern to do, network projects, a little bit of side work in sustainability. And I just fell in love with it. I wasn't expecting to. And I was like, this is just maybe a summer internship on my way to doing bigger and better things, but it is what it is. And so started out. And then I just, very quickly realized, supply chain is the lifeblood of the world economy. It's really critical to be able to drive everything you need to drive in a business. And so I ended up working there over the summer, went back kind of part-time during my third year of my MBA, and then ended up staying there for another probably 7 years after that, after I graduated, and had a variety of roles in that company. But it was really cool because I got to work with a variety of different customers. So, we worked with companies like Estee Lauder and Dow Corning and some of the automotive companies. So I got a lot of, kind of broad-based industry experience there and kind of what those supply chain challenges would be. And then we also, especially during kind of the slow periods during the recession, did a lot of internal strategy work. So I got a lot of exposure to the contract logistics business and the freight forwarding business, and was able to create like a pretty interesting, curiosity-driven career within UTI Worldwide, just around things I was interested in, problems I got to solve, moved around to quite a few areas within that company. But it was a great exposure to supply chain when we ended up ultimately selling the company to DSV. So they became part of DSV, which obviously still exists today and has acquired a number of different companies since then. That was when I kind of decided, okay, I want to try something else. I'll go to the shipper side, try out the shipper side, and ended up finding my way to Abercrombie and Fitch. So it's been a really fun transition because I went from, solving a set of problems across lots of different types of companies and industries to much deeper experience in the specialty retail space and being able to figure out the supply chain of our, specialty retail company.
Sustainability plays a very interesting role in supply chain when you think about overall emissions, finding ways to reduce those scope 3 emissions. I was curious, if that's something that, you're thinking about today, just taking that passion and how we can make some significant improvements there.
Yeah, it's something that I still continue to work on. And ultimately, I think what really attracted me to supply chain and operations in general was the fact that, the best way to make something more efficient from an environmental standpoint is just to make it more efficient, right? So take miles out of the supply chain, take time out. So it's been a really nice way to sort of indirectly achieve some of those goals I originally thought I wanted to, go after, just by being in, the supply chain and operations space as well. I think it's an interesting area it'll be interesting to see what the future holds, because I think what we've seen in the specialty retail space is customers are definitely interested in sustainability, but not always willing to pay for it. So there's, a lot of just, I think, feeling our way through what that looks like from the customer perspective, and, how should we help to support the customer, demand there. But to your question about scope 3, so from a scope 3 emissions perspective, that's really evolved and changed over the last couple of years. So I actually spent a fair amount of time back, in 2009, 2010, 2011, doing carbon footprint assessments at UTI for customers. And we did a lot of, scope 3 emissions calculations. And all of it really was based on just kind of point to point, like as the crow flies, you make some estimations to figure out the emissions for each of the modes. There was not a lot of precision inherent in how that was done, because the tools just didn't exist. And I think what's been really cool to see over the past few years is a lot better tools now, and then a lot more transparency from the transportation industry in general, as there's been more focus on this. So you see a lot more of the shipping companies really starting to, set better targets, be transparent about their emissions, give better access to, hey, your shipment is on this ship and it has this kind of engine and these sort of emissions. And I know P44 is doing a lot of great work in that space to help track. You have companies like Maersk that have these very aggressive zero carbon goals that are coming up in the next decade, which is exciting to see. I'm really encouraged by the fact that a lot of the service providers are starting to set achievable goals, lean in on the biofuels and some of the other, alternative fuels that will help get us there. And I think that's really what's going to help us make the biggest impact on scope 3 emissions, because it's just been a very opaque and difficult thing to manage in the past. And now we're finally able to start to actually see progress against what that looks like. And then the retail industry in general, there's been a big push towards science-based targets for greenhouse gas emissions reduction, particularly in scope 3. We've been continuing to track that and work with our service providers to better understand, where they're going and how they're addressing those issues.
Awesome. Yeah, that was great. I think the best way to make something more sustainable is to make it more efficient. At the end of the episodes, usually we do something like it's called little quick hits. I'm going to ask you a question, and then it's really just supposed to be like kind of what comes to your mind, whether it's either a word or a phrase or just a sentence or two. So the first question I have is, what's one thing you wish everyone who worked in supply chain knew and the industry would be better for it?
I think just the importance of visibility and ensuring that we have a really strong connected visibility ecosystem across all the different partners, and how critical that is. We emphasize to our partners all the time, like, something can be moving, but if we can't see it moving, it might as well not be moving. And so I think there's sometimes an underestimation in the supply chain on how important it is for, our actual systemic visibility to mirror what's actually happening in the real world, because that's what helps us to be agile. That's what helps us to be resilient. If we don't have confidence in where everything is and how it's moving, it's impossible for us to pull levers that will actually make a difference to deliver what the business needs us to deliver.
What is one trait that all the best supply chain professionals seem to have?
One thing that has really inspired me about the leaders I've seen in supply chain that I've really learned the most from is that they're very grounded in the day-to-day, just how things actually happen on the ground. So some of the leaders that I've learned the most from in my career are the leaders that came up from the distribution centers or the freight forwarding branches that were driving the forklift, that, were managing the people on the day-to-day. And they just really have a different kind of understanding of, how the tactical day-to-day supply chain works, and they're willing to get their hands dirty and really see what's going on. And I think getting into the weeds a little bit as a leader is not a bad thing, right? Obviously, you never want to be micromanaging, but being willing to go out there and, I spend a lot of time each year in our Origin offices, and some of our local CFSs at Origin, just being able to really see what's happening on the ground and understand what people are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And then that just helps you be a better leader, because you can understand the challenge better, empower the people better, and just have a better grasp of what you need to do in a crisis situation.
Yeah. Awesome. So I'm going to give you an opportunity. If you could retire one overused buzzword in supply chain today, what would it be?
I'm going to give you one that I've actually spent a lot of time recently explaining and thinking about how do we pitch, but it's control tower. I think control tower is a buzzword that has kind of lost a lot of meaning. And so consequently, there's a lot of great concepts behind it that we, in fact, at A&F are working on developing and trying to implement. But I spend so much time trying to explain what it means because people use it in so many different contexts. And it's hard to like isolate in this context. What do you mean by that? And often it means, a system as well as a process, as well as, some like tech tool that someone developed, as well as, some office that someone has somewhere. It's kind of taken on this, like it means everything and nothing at the same time. And so that's a tricky thing.
Right. Like when something doesn't have a definition, that's when it really starts to become into that buzzword, right?
Mm-hmm.
The concept, of course, is strong, and that's what you were just talking about. But
yeah,
the way it's used is really the problem. In terms of supply chain trends, stuff that you're seeing, you think that there's one that's maybe overrated and maybe one that's underrated that we're hearing a lot in market today all the time? Maybe one that you think that's a little overrated and one that I think we should be talking about that more.
Everyone's talking about AI and, just how much AI is going to take over supply chains, right? And I think that's probably a little bit overrated because my experience has been, we talked earlier about data and connected data, AI tools especially within a company, right? Because we all have to use kind of proprietary versions of this within our companies to protect our data. They rely so much on having good, clean data that's connected across multiple systems. And the reality is that doesn't always exist today. And so I think this idea that AI is going to take over, all of these decisions, whether you want that to happen or don't want that to happen, is probably a little bit too aggressive right now. I think it's going to take a lot more time before everyone has their data in the right places that AI can actually consume to be able to help us do all those things. And I'm a believer in AI in general, but I think that like AI is going to solve all these problems is probably a little overrated. I think what's underrated is probably a focus on the fundamentals. So especially as we think about automation and the use of AI down the road, a lot of that has to depend on like really clean, solid workflows, really clean, solid processes. You automate a bad workflow, you're really not going to achieve anything, better than what you had before, right? You're just going to speed up the chaos or speed up the bad decision making. So I think just that focus on the fundamentals is, really critical to really the success of all of these initiatives in the future. And it probably doesn't get enough, kind of airtime as it.
Absolutely. It's the same thing as the process that we talked about earlier. It's like the fundamentals, the things. It's real nice to talk about tech and talk about AI, and these things are important, but it's the details and the fundamentals and the processes and the people that actually make this stuff work and make it move.
Yep.
You have such an interesting purview and remit in your role, and you know the industry really, really well. Do you have any hot takes on supply chain, or transportation, or tech?
I don't know if it's a hot take, but I would say the thing that I think it always is going to come back to, whether, you're dealing with a crisis environment or the day-to-day or just continuous improvement, is people. And people are never going to not be a critical part of your supply chain. So it's so critical to take care of your people and make sure as you're going through, any situation that you're growing and developing the right talent, but you're also just keeping tabs on your team, making sure they're empowered, continually revisiting your org to make sure it's the right org. We typically really revisit that almost once a year where we're saying, okay, do we need to move people around to get people in the right seats and give people a new challenge and, help solve the problems we have ahead of us this year? And I just don't think you can underestimate that enough, with all the focus on systems and transformation and technology and data. Ultimately it comes down to, your people making the right decisions with all of those tools. So if you don't start there and don't take care of your team, they're not going to be able to deliver what you need. So I guess that's my my hot take is don't forget about your people.
Yeah, that's awesome. We can talk about all the tech, all the AI, all the automation, all the processes and systems and all this stuff. But, at its core, the supply chain is a people business, and it will be. So I think that was great. Well, Kristen, it was amazing to get your perspective, hear a little about your story and the A&F story as well. Thank you very much for taking some time to chat with us, but mostly I want to thank you for being a supply chain champion.
Joel, thanks. It's been a pleasure to be here and talk to you. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you for listening to Supply Chain Champions. To get connected and learn more, visit project44.com and click the link in the comments to subscribe to Project 44's newsletter. Tune in, get smart, and move forward.